STS-95 also ascended above 500 kilometers, the altitude where the South Atlantic anomaly begins. The question is, would one even need to be within the Van Allen belt or outside the Van Allen belt to actually see these light flashes? And if not, how do we know that Van Hoften and Glenn's respective flights were even in the anomaly, or if their orbit inclination took them outside it? On his website, Jay Windley jumps on Sobrel's shuttle flight in question.
The Space Shuttle astronauts, flying at high altitudes that took them into the Van Allen belts, reported seeing flashes of light with their eyes closed. This is a reaction of the eyes to the cosmic radiation in the Van Allen belts. Since the Apollo astronauts did not report any such phenomenon, they obviously didn't venture into the Van Allen belts.
The flashes of light were indeed seen by the Apollo astronauts and were quite thoroughly studied and documented at the time. They were reported by the Apollo 11 crew during their return from the moon. Subsequent crews were asked to pay attention to the phenomena and describe it scientifically. On Apollo 16 and 17, experiments involving photographic plates were performed to characterize and quantify this phenomenon. The conspiracist's relative ignorance of Apollo science has not only compromised his own claim to expertise, but has compelled him to unwittingly confirm a piece of evidence which suggests Apollo's authenticity. How could NASA researchers have published information on this phenomenon in the 1970s without having sent astronauts beyond low Earth orbit to discover it?
Because Windley frequently misquotes conspiracy theorists and relies heavily on his audiences being without their research, I took the liberty of trying to obtain a copy of the interview in question. Unfortunately, Coast to Coast AM does not host archived radio shows on their website, nor could the station provide me with the recordings or even perhaps an official transcript. We contacted Jay Windley via email asking him to provide us with his copy of the radio recording. His response was, quote,
"Sorry, I don't have a recording of the program. I listened to the program when it aired and took written notes on what was said."
Windley, by his own admission, can't expect the world to believe him based on an audio clip that he cannot produce. But what we can prove is that this Bart Sobrel quotation that Windley displays does not reflect in any way Sobrel's argument regarding the flashes.
In 1998, the Space Shuttle flew to an altitude of 350 miles, one of its highest altitudes ever, hundreds of miles below the beginning of a field of radiation that was so severe that the astronauts inside of their shielded spacecraft and inside of their shielded spacesuits saw flashes of light with their eyes shut that they described as shooting stars, due to radiation penetrating first the shuttle's shielding, then their spacesuit shielding, then their skulls, and finally the retinas of their closed eyes.
And here is a clip from his other video, Astronauts Gone Wild, in which he tells Gene Cernan the exact same thing.
I saw a CNN report about 3 years ago. The space shuttle went to about 365 miles. And that was the closest they got to the belts since the moon missions went through them. And they were about, I guess, 650 miles away from the belts. And they reported that it was more dangerous than previously believed. And that when they were 650 miles away, inside a shielding better than you guys used, they could see the radiation with their eyes closed going through their skulls and the retinas of their closed eyes.
Well, I don't know about the shuttle. Shuttle doesn't have the capability to go very far, 400 miles.
Clearly, Sobrel's argument is that astronauts below the Van Allen belts and inside a thicker shielding than the Apollo craft were still able to see these flashes. Case in point, if the shuttle's thicker shielding could not withstand the cosmic rays seen below the Van Allen belts, then how could the Apollo craft's comparatively thinner shielding block out even greater levels of radiation encountered in the Van Allen belts? It seems that Windley is not interested in disproving the message, but rather misdirecting the reader.
And there is strong reason to doubt that the Sibrel quote is what Windley says it is.
J. Windley insists that the Apollo 11 crew saw the light flashes first. And Alan Bean claims that they hadn't been discovered by Apollo 12.
Not on our mission, by the way, they hadn't been discovered yet.
Obviously, if the Apollo 11 crew discovered the phenomenon, then how could they also not have been discovered by Apollo 12? Obviously, someone's blown it. On July 4, 2006, shortly after I publicly pointed this out in video and on the Loose Change forum, Windley responded by updating his website. He not only completely misrepresented my argument, but also attributed it to Bart Sibrel, as though he was the one who jumped on these contradictory statements.
Apollo 12 lunar module pilot Alan Bean, in an interview, said that as of his mission the light flashes hadn't been discovered yet.
It is unclear what Bean meant by discovered. It is a matter of relatively undisputable historical record that Apollo 11 astronauts observed the light flashes. If Bean means to say that no observations of the phenomenon were made until after his Apollo 12 mission, then his memory is an error. The light flash phenomenon wasn't exhaustively discussed scientifically between Apollos 11 and 12. When Al Bean flew his mission, science knew little more about what might be causing the flashes than they did when Apollo 11 reported them, and there were no plans to study them explicitly on Apollo 12. The explicit studies came later. Either way, it is immaterial. Mr. Sibrel simply tries to muddy the waters in order to maintain the semblance of correctness. His original claim remains debunked. The light flashes were observed and studied prior to the high-altitude shuttle flight in question, whether that was first published in 1969 or in 1972. The Apollo crews did report the phenomenon, indicating that they indeed were not limited to low Earth orbit, as Sibrel asserts.
Bart Sibrel is not the one who pointed out these contradictions. I am. I honestly cannot consider J. Windley a serious researcher when he routinely puts words in people's mouths and mismatches messengers and messages.
Windley begs the question, how could NASA have known about this phenomenon without sending astronauts out of Earth orbit to discover it? But he fails to mention that such sightings were predicted long before even Gagarin went up. The man who predicted these sightings was Dr. Cornelius Tobias. As Space.com tells us, before anyone ever went into space, Cornelius Tobias, a Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory expert on the biological effects of radiation, suggested in 1952 that cosmic rays might interact in some way with the human visual system, which is designed to perceive photons, not protons. He later tested the idea on himself and colleagues using a particle accelerator. But the tests were discontinued because of health concerns. You see visual flashes, Tobias said later, prior to his death in 2000. It is an exhilarating sensation. It is as though you are looking into the universe itself.
Not only does Windley neglect to mention that this phenomenon was predicted long before Apollo 11's alleged discovery, he also fails to reveal that these flashes were noted by cosmonauts aboard the Mir space station, which never flew into the Anomaly. Evidently, you wouldn't need to actually go into the belts in order to spot these flashes, as Windley is trying to allege. You can see them even if you are below the belts.
And Windley's followers know this to be true. Here is David Greer, posting on the Loose Change forum in July 2008, in which he posts a link to Sobrell's video segment on light flashes. Greer writes, "This linked video mentions non-Apollo astronauts below the Van Allen belts seeing flashes of light."
In 1998, the Space Shuttle flew to an altitude of 350 miles, one of its highest altitudes ever, hundreds of miles below the beginning of a field of radiation that was so severe that the astronauts inside of their shielded spacecraft and inside of their shielded spacesuits saw flashes of light with their eyes shut that they described as shooting stars, due to radiation penetrating first the shuttle's shielding, then their spacesuit shielding, then their skulls, and finally the retinas of their closed eyes.